Welcome, everyone. As people stream in, I'll just get started. I'm excited to be here with you to welcome you to the Legacy of the Settlement House Movement, our September 2023 Conscience Matters webinar. My name is Ashley Nelson, and I'm the Director of Communications at the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. And it's my honor to welcome you today. For those of you joining us for the first time, the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience, ICSC, or the Coalition for short, is the only global network of historic sites, museums, and memory initiatives that connect past struggles to today's movements for human rights and social justice. Founded in 1999, we have over 350 members in 65 countries, from Ellis Island in New York City to former centers of detainment in Argentina, to sites that remember and learn from the transatlantic slave trade in West Africa. While our members focus on a range of subjects, what connects them is their belief that history should be used as a transformative tool for positive change. At Sites of Conscience, memory is considered to be the best weapon civil society has against injustice. By remembering the world's most challenging periods and giving voice to those who have been historically silenced, Sites of Conscience seek justice for harms done so that peaceful futures may take root. In short, we preserve memory, promote truth, and pursue justice. For information on how to join, please visit our website. Our 2023 webinar series, entitled If Memory Serves, on the uses and abuses of remembering, examines the many roles memory plays in contemporary topics and conversations in social justice, from the war in Ukraine to Black Lives Matter to immigration. Drawing on the experiences of survivors, scholars, practitioners, and most of all, Sites of Conscience, who for over 20 years have functioned as laboratories designed to find the most effective, ethical, and equitable uses of memory. Webinars generally take place on the third Thursday of every month at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. Please visit our events page on our website for more information. One quick note today, just a kind of housekeeping thing. Attendees will not be able to use the chat box. However, you are encouraged and welcome to submit questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. The panelists and moderators will be able to view those questions and answer them at the end of the session. So today I'm going to rather quickly hand over the mic, so to speak, to Ken Turino, who will be moderating today's discussion. Ken is Manager of Community Partnerships and Resource Development at Historic New England and on the faculty of Tufts University's Museum Studies Department. He teaches courses on exhibition planning and reimagining historic house museums. Ken has been on the board of the House of Seven Gables Settlement Association for the past 6 years and has just stepped down as their president. A curator, educator, director, producer, and author, Ken's most recent publication with Max Van Balgui is Reinventing the Historic House Museum, New Approaches and Proven Solutions from Roman and Littlefield. His new book, due out in 2024, will be Interpreting Christmas and Winter Holidays in Historic Sites and Museums. Without further ado, I will hand it over to Ken to introduce our topic and our panelists. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ashley, and thank you, Sites of Conscience, for allowing us to do this presentation today. I got involved in this because I really was passionate about the mission of the House of Seven Gables Settlement Association, and you'll hear more about that. Just to set the stage, excuse me, I'm going to talk a little bit before I introduce our panelists about the settlement movement. The settlement house movement in America began in the late 19th century as a social reform movement in response to the rapid urbanization and industrialization taking place in America's cities. Urban areas were experiencing a massive influx of immigrants and a growing divide between the wealthy elite and the working class poor. The movement aimed to address the social and economic challenges faced by immigrant communities and the urban poor by establishing settlement houses in impoverished neighborhoods. Now, these settlement houses served as centers for community support, education, and social services. You will learn about some of that history today. Settlement house workers were not only focused on direct services, but also engaged in advocacy and social reform efforts. They worked to improve labor conditions, housing standards, and public health. And they advocated for women's rights, child labor laws, and social welfare programs. And that varied with sites. The settlement house movement had a significant impact on American society. By the early 20th century, there were hundreds of settlement houses across the United States. Today, the number of settlement houses has declined for a number of reasons. Those that remain, and they take a variety of forms, as you're going to hear today, play a vital role in their communities. And this is something that I think all of us can learn from, and it can be a lesson for all of us. So I'm going to introduce the speakers. Before we start with the first presentation, I do want to say we are going to give you plenty of time for questions. So please, please do put your questions in the Q&A. And we will get to them at the end. Again, we're going to leave plenty of time for questions. Now, on to our speakers. Nadia Maragha is the education manager at Jane Addams Hull House Museum and has been part of their team for nearly 4 years. She holds a master's degree in political science with a research background in comparative urban politics, immigration trends, and the international human rights issues. She has worked in a variety of educational spaces and is passionate about community engagement and access, as well as modern interpretation within historical and social justice education. And next up, Katie Vogel has worked as the public historian at Henry Street Settlement since 2017. She leads tours of the settlement's permanent history exhibition, The House on Henry Street, and plans panel discussions and neighborhood walking tours about Lower East Side history. Through Henry Street, she's part of a group of public historians called the Close Friends Collective, the creators of the queer history walking tour of the Lower East Side. Vogel received her master's degree from Brown University's Public Humanities program in the Department of American Studies. For 5 years, she worked at the Tenement Museum, leading tours about immigration history for school groups, English language learners, and the public. And then, our last speaker will be Dakota Russell, the executive director of the House of Seven Gables Settlement Association. Now, prior to joining the House of Seven Gables, Russell led the Heart Mountain, Wyoming Foundation, which preserves the site where over 14,000 Japanese Americans were unjustly incarcerated during World War II. He began his career with the Missouri State Parks and Historic Sites, where his work in interpretation and cultural resource management took him everywhere, from Native American villages to frontier homesteads to Civil War battlefields. Russell believes that history benefits from a plurality of voices, and throughout his career has worked to ensure that diverse viewpoints and the stories of marginalized groups are better represented on the cultural landscape. And with that, I am going to turn this over to Nadia.
Hello, everybody. Hope everybody's doing good this morning. So I'm going to jump in and start talking about Hull House. As I mentioned in my bio, I've been here for about 4 years now. And my general area of work at the museum is leading public programs. Leading educational programs, tours, and so on. And one of the things that we really highlight is the importance of the history of the work done at Hull House and the nature of it. So Hull House was founded in 1889 in Chicago, Illinois. It was founded by Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr. And the idea behind it was really centered in, it was a traditional settlement house in many ways, but it was also very non-traditional because a lot of the founding principles were centered in access to the arts and civic engagement. Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr really believed that giving people a chance to be able to have access to creative and cultural spaces gave people a stronger incentive and ability to be involved in change within their communities and on larger levels as well. Hull House was one of the earliest settlement houses in the country. It's also ended up becoming the blueprint for many settlement houses throughout the United States. The approach in Hull House started out within arts programs. The first of the expanded buildings in the settlement was actually the city's first public art gallery. But they also were providing, even early on, very important social and like public health based support to the community. The first program that I hope that actually opened at Hull House was a daycare and nursery. So they were trying to meet the needs of the community around them, which was pretty much one of the most impoverished communities within the city of Chicago during this time. It was predominantly an immigrant community. During that era, there were very large numbers of Italian, Greek, and Russian, Polish immigrants living in the area, but it was quite a diverse makeup, mostly European, during that first like 30 years of Hull House's operation. Over time, that demographic shifted. It did retain those large Greek and Italian communities, and expanded as well into Mexican and Black communities surrounding the Hull House settlement. One of the most important things also that really separated Hull House from most of its contemporary spaces was that it was predominantly a women's space. It was founded by women. Most of the programs and the like wider management of the institution was done by women. And it was also a space where reformers were gathering. They were being drawn to Hull House by the work that was being done there, and sort of fostering a space where this first generation of mostly upper class white women who were attending college for the first time in the US became a safe haven really for them to come and begin working within their fields of both that they were passionate about and that they had studied within. And so you saw them leading reform in areas like education, labor reform, public health changes, labor safety and protocol, juvenile justice. It's very, very widespread areas of work. And then within Hull House, basically any program you can think of that a community would need, there was a program addressing that at Hull House somehow, whether that be citizenship classes, English language classes, public health initiatives, clinics, employment offices, so on and so forth. But then they've always retained and really centered that arts element. And so they had an art school, they had handcraft and like large scale arts-based programs that community members could participate in very easily. So a little bit about Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr. Jane Addams was she and Ellen Gates Starr were both from pretty rural areas outside of Chicago, and grew up in wealthy families that really fostered within them a sense of responsibility. They believed that they needed to be involved in contributing to better the world somehow. And they actually visited Toynbee Hall, the very first settlement house in the world, in England, in London, where they were really inspired to pull forward that settlement house idea into the realm that they had a little more access in, which is back in near their hometowns in Chicago. And so they made massive changes, both within the city and on larger levels. Jane Addams became the first American woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize, thanks to both her work at Hull House, as well as the work that she did with organizations and initiatives all over the country to support major social change, and her international peace activism. Ellen Gates Starr became very involved in political action and labor reform as time went on. She always maintained that very close connection to the arts. But as time, as she got more invested within the community, she was out on, protesting on picket lines with strikers and getting into trouble for that. And so today at Hull House, we have changed a little bit in terms of how we interact with the community. So Hull House was eventually, it did end. It closed in 2012, but prior to that, it closed in its original location. It had been a complex that was made up of 13 buildings. In the early 1960s, the city of Chicago wanted to expand the University of Illinois Chicago campus. And so they actually chose the neighborhood where Hull House was located as the location for that campus. And so they ended up, demolishing the space, building the campus there instead, and the Hull House Association decentralized and operated out of many different locations around the city. So today we're no longer a functioning settlement house and don't provide settlement house programs. We are actually a museum, and we still connect with the community in many ways. So we have many programs that are centered around the legacy of Hull House's work, social justice programs, arts programs. We connect with and work with social justice, arts, and education organizations around the city. We also connect with the university community. We're part of the University of Illinois at Chicago now. And we work with students and faculty to create programs, bring them into the space, and continue teaching about the Hull House's work and its legacy. And we continue to connect with the community with those public programs that we host here. And so it is a little bit of a different incarnation of the space, but we keep the spirit alive. Thank you.
Okay, well, next up is Katie.
Thank you, Nadia. I think you'll hear that there is quite a bit of overlap between the history of the Hull House and Henry Street settlement. So again, I'm Katie Vogel, and I work as a public historian at Henry Street. Henry Street is located on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and the building that you see in this picture is the headquarters building. This is where our founder had lived at the turn of the 20th century. It was a building that was donated by a wealthy banker named Jacob Schiff, who believed in the mission of Henry Street. But now Henry Street is much, much larger than this one building. There are 18 locations in the Lower East Side, and Henry Street serves 50,000 New Yorkers, doing a very similar mission as it was founded to do, which I'll talk about. So Henry Street is a social services organization in the present. And in this headquarters building, we do have a little museum, and I lead history tours through the building and walking tours of the neighborhood. And it's so cool that Henry Street invests in telling its history at the same time as continuing to do similar work as it was founded to do. So the black and white photo that you see on the screen here is turn of the 20th century, a typical street on the Lower East Side. This neighborhood, when Henry Street was founded in 1893, was referred to as the gateway to America, because it was often a first place that new immigrants and migrants would come to. It was close to where the Statue of Liberty is and Ellis Island, about a 30 or 40-minute walk. So people, as they arrived, would walk to the Lower East Side. And again, it was often a first place that people would live. At the turn of the 20th century, this was a mostly Eastern European Jewish neighborhood and Italian neighborhood, also very close to Manhattan's Chinatown, which is one of the oldest neighborhoods in New York City. And this area has been home to so many different immigrant and migrant communities over time. Next slide, please. So Henry Street was founded by Lillian Wald in 1893. Lillian Wald was a trained nurse. And so the first program of Henry Street was a nursing service. And that is one of the things that made Henry Street unique in terms of other services that other settlement houses provided. And other settlement houses had clinics, But what Henry Street's nursing service did is that they went out into the community. You can see the action in this photo, the nurses standing on the stoops. They have their bags with all their materials to go into people's homes. And the reason why they did this is because Lillian Wald, after spending some time in the Lower East Side, estimated that about 90% of people who were sick in the neighborhood would just stay at home if they were sick. And this is due to so many different barriers to accessing care, of course, financial, but also language barriers, fear of discrimination, reliance on home remedies. There's a lot of reasons for why there was such a high number. But the nurses did really active grassroots outreach to the neighborhood to find the people who needed help the most. Next slide, please. So the nursing service actually went all over New York City. They were doing preventative care, as well as looking at all of the structures that were in place that were contributing to people getting sick. So Lillian Wald was actually known for coining the term public health nursing, because she was not just treating people if they were sick, right? She was addressing housing issues and overcrowding and, looking at labor and pushing for labor rights. So she was really looking at how all the different aspects of people's lives intersected. The picture that is on the right, the group of children that you see here, this is from the Stillman House branch of Henry Street. So Elizabeth Tyler, who was the first African-American nurse who was hired by Henry Street in the early 1900s, really pushed Lillian Wald to make sure that the nursing service was reaching Black Americans as well. And, Henry Street from the very beginning had in word said that the services were open to anyone, but Elizabeth Tyler really pushed Lillian Wald to make sure that that was happening in action as well. And so Elizabeth Tyler identified the neighborhood of San Juan Hill, which was on Manhattan's west side, where Lincoln Center is today, north of Times Square. And at the time in the early 1900s, that was the city's largest Black neighborhood, African Americans and immigrants of African descent. And Elizabeth Tyler started this whole nursing service and provided all kinds of social services at this branch of Henry Street as well. So the nurses were not only in the Lower East Side, they were really traveling all throughout the city. And they were providing this nursing care on a sliding scale for free or affordable rates, whatever families could afford. Next slide, please. So as the nurses are going into people's homes, they are identifying needs beyond just treating people if they're sick. They're seeing people in their environment and really getting to know the families as neighbors. That's a term that Lillian Wald was really conscious about using, was actually not referring to people as patients or clients, but as neighbors. And they were seeing that some of their neighbors needed jobs or access to English lessons. And so all of these other programs at Henry Street grew out of this nursing service. They hosted all kinds of classes and clubs as well, which a lot of other settlement houses were doing as well. I don't have a ton of time to talk about this, but there were several other settlement houses right in the area of the Lower East Side at the same time as Henry Street. And some of them had overlapping services. As I mentioned before, one of the things that made Henry Street really unique was this nursing service. Next slide, please. And Lillian Wald also really scaled up the programs that she was providing on the Lower East Side. So she did a lot of advocacy work and activism work too. And that's one of the things that made Henry Street unique, and also where you see a lot of overlaps with the Hull House of not just providing direct service to community, but also fighting for structural change. So Lillian Wald started several programs that still exist in New York City today and across the country. So she placed the first school nurse in a public school in the United States, and that started at a school on the Lower East Side. And then she also started free school lunches and special education classes in public schools in New York. In all the cases that I just mentioned of school nurses, free school lunches, and special education classes. It was really about providing access, right? They were seeing that kids were falling behind in school if they had to leave due to even a minor ailment, may not come back to school for a while if they didn't have access to care. Or in the case of the school lunches, it's very hard to learn when you're hungry. Also, Lillian Wald was involved in fighting for labor rights, children's labor rights, supporting unions, providing space at the settlement for unions to meet. She also fought for the rights of immigrants at a time when several very racist immigration laws were getting passed. And she also fought for racial justice, most notably in the form of being a co-founder of the NAACP, which was founded in 1909. And Jane Addams was actually a co-founder as well, alongside people like W.E.B. Du Bois and Ida B. Wells. And the NAACP had one of its first meetings as a group in person, face-to-face, in Henry Street's dining room in the building that I showed you at the beginning of my slides. Next slide, please. Here's some pictures of the interior of the dining room that I just mentioned. That's what it still looks like today. Throughout our headquarters building, it's really a mix of different kinds of spaces of, our office space, but also these historic spaces as well. This is actually where Lillian Wald lived at 265 Henry Street, which is our headquarters today. And she lived here with a team of nurses. And that was the model of the settlement house that the workers lived on site. And Lillian Wald referred to the people who supported each other as the family. And I think that's really significant because this is who she thought of as her family and her support system. She didn't get married and have kids of her own, which would have been the expectation of her growing up as a middle upper class, growing up in a middle upper class family. We actually know of a few romantic relationships that Lillian Wald had with women. And at the time, she didn't call herself a lesbian or gay or queer. That's not how she self-identified, but we do know that she was a queer person. And I think that's a really important aspect of our history. Henry Street's historic building at 265 Henry Street is actually an LGBT historic site today that we just got that designation about a year ago. And that's an update to our landmark historic status. And we're one of, I believe, about 50 in the country who have that status. Next slide, please. So I mentioned at the beginning that we do have a little museum on site at the headquarters, but the bulk of what Henry Street does is provide services to the community, direct services, just in a very similar way as Henry Street was founded. So if you'd like to learn about in depth all of our different programs, you can visit henrystreet.org, but I'll just mention about a few of them. That we have programs that are in education and employment. You see a picture on the screen here of one of our ESOL programs, transitional and supportive housing, senior services, the arts, that's in one of these pictures too, and health and wellness, mostly mental health services today, and 60 programs, right? I mentioned before, Henry Street serves about 50,000 New Yorkers, not only in the Lower East Side, but across the 5 boroughs. So I'll end my presentation there and happy to answer any questions at the end. Thank you.
Right, Dakota, you're up.
Happy to. So I think it's really great that Nadia and Katie kicked us off here. The House of the Seven Gables as a settlement house arrives a little later on the scene. And I think what's fascinating is you'll see a lot of Jane Addams and Lillian Wald's influence in the programs that they eventually take on. They are definitely watching and learning from the settlement houses that have come before them. But let's talk a little bit about the house itself to kick things off. The house is located in Salem, Massachusetts, and if you ask most people about the House of the Seven Gables today, they know us as a museum. As we'll discuss, we actually function still as both a museum and a settlement house. But most people are familiar with our more public side there. The house itself was built in 1668, one of the oldest historic house museums in America. It was a time when Salem was one of the richest cities on the continent, when you had these huge amounts of wealth, mostly through the maritime trade, that were coming into the city. The house itself belonged to a series of ship captains that really were able to accumulate these great fortunes here. And then it winds up in the hands of a woman named Susanna Ingersoll, who happens to be a cousin to the author Nathaniel Hawthorne, who writes a book in 1851 that is fictional book, but set in the house, called The House of the Seven Gables, instantly becomes a bestseller. By the 1880s, even when it's still a private home, we have tourists already coming to see the famous House of the Seven Gables in Salem. Let's advance to the next slide. We'll talk a little bit about how our founder capitalizes on this. This is Carolyn Emerton, who you see in the center of the photograph, working with some of the settlement students. She is the founder of the House of the Seven Gables Settlement Association. Born into Salem in 1866, she is the heir to a major shipping fortune and a railroading fortune. And she is really raised with a sense of duty that comes with this wealth. Her grandparents and her parents both have become very involved in philanthropy. Carolyn grows up with that sort of value instilled in her, but takes a much more hands-on approach than her ancestors had there. Salem by this time has sort of peaked at the height of its wealth there and is on sort of a downward trend by the end of the 19th century. The harbor is too shallow for the big ships anymore. Boston has quickly picked up and surpassed it as the main port in the United States. And so Salem has seen better days at that point. And Carolyn realizes this, and in the next slide, we'll see how she starts to address it. So we actually see the house here in 1910, and this gives you a little sense of what the Derby Street neighborhood looks like at that time. Now, Derby Street at that time is sitting in between just a massive textile mill that has been established in Salem and a number of leather tanneries that are around as well. And so it's gone from being this merchant city to this very industrial city that requires a lot of labor there. And this labor primarily comes from the folks who are willing to take the jobs that have the lowest pay with the longest hours, which tend to be newly arrived immigrants in the United States. Derby Street has gone from this sort of showpiece for the city where you had these big mansions that belonged to these captains and these ship owners and these merchants that either now have been subdivided into tenement apartments or have been surrounded with sort of these three-decker tenements that are going up in the latter half of the 1800s there. And you start seeing people move in from all over the place. Initially, the Irish are the largest group of immigrants here, but are quickly surpassed by the Polish. For most of the time that the House of the Seven Gables is here, that's going to be the biggest audience for the settlement. We also have Ukrainians and Russian, primarily Jewish immigrants coming to Salem. And then we have Italian, Greek, and Syrian as well that will come in and be served by the house. So Carolyn initially starts that building on the far right of the slide right there with the steeple. You see, that's Seaman's Bethel. That was the original location for the settlement house, but it was very, very small. Carolyn recognized very early that they needed more space. The House of the Seven Gables came up for sale. And so she purchased it with the intent of turning it into a museum and a settlement house, restored the exterior to what you see here. This is just right after the restoration in 1910. Which was sort of its appearance around 1700 or so. And in the inside sort of set it up to look like as it appeared in Nathaniel Hawthorne's novel, right? Again, fictional, so sort of fantasy on the inside. But that's not all that's going on the inside. If we can advance to the next slide. And so all throughout the days, you have tours that are going through this house, learning more about Nathaniel Hawthorne's novel, learning more about Salem's history. This is the admissions desk that you see that's also set up as the scent shop. Hepzibah's scent shop is a sort of prime location in the book. And so while these tours are running in and out, though, you also have settlement classes that are taking place, sometimes in the furnished rooms themselves. And you also have at this time about 12 social workers who are living inside of the house that form the core of the settlement staff. As Katie addressed earlier, that's sort of the settlement model, is that everybody kind of lives together in the neighborhood where they work, so that they can, treat the people that they work with as neighbors. And so it's a very, very busy house that you've got going on here. The museum, of course, creates the revenues, and the revenues go back directly to feeding the settlement classes and helping to support them, as well as seeking other donations and charging small fees for those who can afford it for the classes right there. So let's talk a little bit about those classes on the next slide. House of the Seven Gables very early focuses primarily on a youth audience. One thing that you see in a lot of cities where the adults are off working, these 60-hour weeks in factories, is you see a lot of juvenile delinquency. And that was the case in Salem as well. And so the idea was to give the children something to do, something positive to occupy their time there. And so they really started with sports and gymnastics classes. They had gardens, they had playgrounds. They also started with English classes and then cooking classes, other skills classes, carpentry, construction trades, all sorts of things for children to get involved in. But it wasn't exclusively children either. Early on, the Gables starts what they call the Mothers Club, which is centered on engaging the adults in the community and becoming a gathering place, but also a place where they can address issues that are going on in the neighborhood. That eventually becomes two clubs, the Polish Mothers Club and then the Jewish Mothers Club joins it shortly afterwards. And then eventually there's a men's club as well. And so it really becomes the hub of this community as they'd imagined. It becomes as much driven by the neighborhood and their needs as it is driven by the agenda of the social workers there. In addition to that, we sort of pick and choose from everything that Nadia and Katie just talked about there. We have a dental dispensary for a while. We have a public health nurse program, never as big as Henry Street Settlement. It's only just one nurse that goes around to the neighborhood making visits there. We open a kindergarten, as happened at Hull House there, in daycare. We get very much involved in scouting programs in the United States, having some of the first Boy Scout troops, Campfire Girls, Girl Scouts, and Sea Scouts in the US. And so you see a great diversity of programs that happen throughout the years. And so the settlements program with us sort of changes and evolves throughout the years. I want to talk about where it's landed today. So if we can advance to the next slide. So today, in addition to operating the museum and historic site here in Salem, we also continue our settlement work mainly through free English as a second language and citizenship preparation classes that we offer free to residents here on the North Shore of Boston. Our audience has changed considerably. Primarily, we work with immigrants from the Dominican Republic and other homes in the Caribbean there that have come to the United States. But that's not the extent of it. We had in our last round of settlement classes, I think 20 countries of origin for folks. So it's a very diverse program that we work with there. Because our programs has grown and also because our attendance has grown at the museum, it's not really feasible for us to do these on the campus anymore. And so our classes take place at different locations with partner organizations around the city. So right now we've got some that are running at another museum in the city, a larger, more traditional museum, the Peabody Essex Museum. We've got some at a community center called Spazio here in the city. And then we've got some that are set up at some temporary emergency housing that the Commonwealth of Massachusetts had set up. So that's what we call our emergency ESL. These are folks that are just coming and need to know the basics in order to get around. And so that's been a really successful program for us, but not the extent of what we do. If we move to the next slide. We've also tried to evolve our perception of what a settlement house can be and think of it as much more of a two-way street. It's not just about what services can we offer for immigrant communities, but also what are immigrant communities bringing to the North Shore that's beneficial to everybody else that's already here, and how can we amplify both their concerns and both what they have to offer here. And so we do a lot of cultural programming as well, both talking about the issues that are of concern to these immigrant groups, but also talking about their culture. A good example is last year we started a big series of programs with resettled Ukrainians here on the North Shore. And so it was a mix of things. The one that you're seeing here is a Vareniki class, which is a Ukrainian pierogi, basically, that we're teaching folks to make. And so you have these little cultural moments, but we also took time out to talk about the big issue of concern for them, which is the war in Ukraine and what's going on with them and their perspective as resettled Ukrainians on what's happening, which was really fascinating, and I think really shined a spotlight on a community that a lot of people may not have even realized was here in Salem. In addition to that, on the next slide, I want to talk about something that we're working very hard on right now, which is to bring that sort of settlement house story into our regular interpretation. When Carolyn Emerton conceived of the House of the Seven Gables as a museum, she never conceived that we would actually be talking about settlement house history that much, right? She was focused more on, 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. But now we really want to start bringing some of that story in and start connecting the pieces of what we do a little better by letting our daily visitors know this is who we are and this is the tradition that we come from. And I think it's important because a lot of people don't really realize the story of settlement houses and how pivotal they were in America and the way we think about social work and social services. And so we're really excited to be incorporating more of that into our programming. Probably the biggest way that we're doing it is we actually have a room of the house that we are developing right now, and for the first time putting on the public tours, that right now you can see it's just a temporary section on our settlements in the past and what it looks like now. But eventually we're going to have this set up as a social worker's bedroom from around the 1950s. That will tell some of those stories and be a forum for talking about that part of the house's history. It'll be our first 20th century room in the house too, which is really interesting. And so we're really excited to bring that online. I think it's a story that resonates with a lot of folks. And so that's a little bit of the way that we continue to carry sort of the spirit of where we came from and the legacy forward into the present.
Okay, thank you, Dakota, and thank you all for sharing your histories and the good service that you're continuing to do today. As you can see from this presentation, we have three very distinct sites, but what stands out is that clearly history is a big part of what they do today. Some are still functioning as purely settlement houses, some are museums, and so on. But all of you are tied to your original missions, which is outstanding. We do have questions, and I'm going to ask our participants today to please, if you have questions, type them in the Q&A. And I'm going to address some of these to individuals, but some of these are for all of you. So one of the questions to start out was that the question is, Jane Addams and Lillian Wald were peers and communicated often, but I am curious about the connection between leaders in the national settlement movement. Were there any coalitions or ways in which leaders of settlement houses engaged with each other? It's open to anyone.
That's a good Nadia question, since Jane Addams was at the head of this.
Kind of not, because I'm really not too sure about coalitions or larger organizations that brought those people together. I know Jane Addams was involved with many organizations that were working for social reform on larger levels. And I know that she was in communication with many, like Lillian Wald, who were working within settlement spaces and doing that work around the country, and outside of the country. But unfortunately, I can't speak to organized things. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, no problem. I can add as well that one of the things that Jane Addams did do that early in the 1900s, when there were more settlement houses on the scene, when you were talking hundreds of them in the U.S., she did form the National Federation of Settlement Houses, which was an organization that existed for most of the first half of the 20th century and then sort of dwindled away a little bit. It's one of the things that excites me a lot in just pulling the three of us together, because I think as settlement houses is kind of dispersed into their different directions, we don't always talk to each other as much. And there's so much interesting that we share that conversations like this are really important.
And I'll just add to that as well, at Henry Street, social workers, nurses, activists, those who were involved in public health and social reform, like from all over the world, came to Henry Street. And we have like these amazing guest books that have people's names and lovely notes. And we're like going through all of those right now and doing research on them. Because a lot of the people who wrote in these guest books aren't household names to us now, but as you start to dig into who they were, it's incredible, this incredible network of reformers. And then I'll also add, in terms of speaking to other settlement houses today and that network that's more in the present day, Henry Street is part of this group of settlement houses in New York that's called the United Neighborhood Houses. And that makes up, it's 40 settlement houses that are still in New York today, which is pretty wild. They don't all have the term settlement house as part of their name or, are from that time period. Not all of them are from that time period, but the idea of it is organizations that provide wraparound services to a community. So not like a standalone senior center or a standalone education center. It's that idea that I was talking about before of just, providing all services to a community.
Right, good. We're getting lots of questions. Can you talk, this is from Heather, can you talk more about how the settlement house programs were and are funded, both historically and currently? That's for all of you. Who wants to start? Katie.
Oh, go ahead, Nadia. I saw you're about to speak.
That's okay. Yeah, for Hull House, historically, much of the funding was private funding that was coming from philanthropists and from socialites and wealthy individuals around the city. A lot of it was coming from organizations that were interested in investing in and supporting programs that either were already happening at Hull House or that they wanted to foster. And then in its later years, it was really relying on a lot of public funding and funding from the city. So it was a variety of sources that money was coming from.
Similar with Henry Street, Lillian Wald's time, it was privately funded by wealthy individuals, a lot of whom had, immigrated to the United States at the same time as Lillian Wald's parents, like 1840s. And had made some wealth in the United States and saw it as giving back to a newer immigrant community by funding the settlement. And then you see a big shift by New Deal era, 1930s, of the government providing more social services. And today, Henry Street, I believe, is about 70% government funded. And that is mostly in terms of long-term contracts for specific programs.
And I already talked a little bit about how the Gables was traditionally funded. Obviously tour revenues never met all of the need, and so donations were an important part of it. Those small class fees never made up anything. In fact, I was reading the other day in some of the early reports, and they were like, they don't really do anything, but the children are so proud to show up with their nickel to purchase their tuition there. But it's as it's evolved, we've had to think of a lot of different ways to sort of support it. Today, in addition to museum revenues. We also rely on donations, of course. We have a patchwork of grants, both government grants and private grants that we use in order to make these happen. And, you know, a lot of volunteer work too, a lot of donated time that helps to make this program happen.
So this is for all of you. Why did the settlement movement decline after the mid 20th century? Who wants to start?
Could you repeat that, please?
Yes. Why did the settlement movement as a specific movement decline after the mid 20th century?
Well, I think that Katie touched on it there, is that really what you start to see is the settlement movement sort of comes up outside of the regular channels, right? It's in large part these group of women who are educated, who see that the system as it's built is not working, that it's just built to exploit those in the lowest classes and not lift them up. And so they are largely barred from professional advancement because they're female. And so they build something new, which I think is what's really part of what's interesting about the settlement story is they decide to come up with this new system here. As Katie noted, by the 1930s, you know, people have largely seen this as a success, you know, seen this kind of social work that's developed in America as a success, and it starts getting incorporated into sort of the New Deal policies that come up in the wake of the Depression there. And these things get formalized and turned into government services. And so there becomes less and less need for these sorts of umbrella organizations like settlement houses. And instead, organizations start to sort of become more specific and more narrow there.
Well, Patricia asks, how many settlement houses still exist in name and continue to function in addressing the changing needs of the communities they serve? Anyone have a count? I certainly don't.
I don't know nationwide. I had mentioned in New York about 40, but not all of those are like from Lilienwald's time and have stayed in existence the whole time. So no, I don't know nationwide. Does anyone else know?
I got a question, and I ballparked it at around 100, 150 that draw their roots back, that I was sort of able to kind of look for in lists that I saw online, right? There's a good chance that there's more than that, because as Katie said, a lot of them have dropped a lot of the former associations and are functioning in a different space now. And so while they may draw back to that, they may not always have it right up front.
Well, it looks like that might be a good research project for some of you in your spare time. Okay, well, there's lots of thanks in the chat. You'll all have to look at that. Caitlin writes that our settlement organization in our city was founded by someone who is described as, quote, graduate of Hull House in Chicago. And what does that mean, they're asking. So, Nadia, you want to take that?
That most likely means that it was someone who started out working at Hull House, involved in the programs here. And then, so that it was kind of a transitory space. The people who worked at Hull House usually stayed for shorter periods of time. Most of them didn't stay and live on site like the way Jane Addams did, or some of the other residents where they lived there the majority of their lives. Many of them, the majority stayed for anywhere between 6 months to a few years, and then would move on into whatever other work that they wanted to do. And so most likely this person had been at Hull House for a shorter period of time, and then may have gathered skills there and learned how to run an institution like a settlement, and then went on their own way and moved somewhere else and opened a settlement of their own.
Nadia, do you have a running list of those? That can
Unfortunately, I do not. I'm sorry. There were literally so many people. At its height, there would be sometimes about 100 people living and working on site at the same time. So it was just so widespread in terms of the work done and the people who came and went.
Well, you all are in different communities. Fran writes, I wonder what you see as the biggest challenges and unmet needs of immigrants and refugees today. And are we social workers, Fran's a social working, doing enough to advocate for support and equity for our newcomers and potential newcomers? That's a big question.
I can jump us off. I think if I look at it, the biggest challenge that we have is really a system that's stacked against them, which is kind of hard to fight back against. Is you've got something that is in many cases, bureaucratic, and in some cases outright hostile to new immigrants that has been built over the years, and trying to figure out sort of how we as a private organization can help with that has been a big issue that we've discussed a lot, and I think that in the future, we're hoping to get involved more in sort of that naturalization space and get more affiliated, what Department of Justice calls a recognized organization that can come in and act more as a representative and offer advice in a more professional capacity to immigrant communities. That's one of the spaces that we see that I think we're really going to get involved in the next 5 to 10 years, just because we can only do so much when we're not able to directly intervene.
And I'll just add that, Henry Street has existed for 130 years, and the neighborhood has changed so many different times with different communities moving in, migrant communities, immigrant communities, and has had to remain flexible to what are the needs at different times. And this is one of those moments too, right? With a new influx of immigrants and migrants, and not enough housing and not enough resources. And that's something that Henry Street really is on the front lines of, and is right in the middle of also figuring out how to respond and to live up to our legacy as an organization that has been on the front lines doing that work for so long.
Housing is huge right now. Yeah, same for us as well.
So we've got a number of questions and we've only got a few minutes, so I'm going to try to get to as many as I can. How do you tell your settlement stories? By taking into consideration the class and racial hierarchies. How are you using your local communities in history meaning making? Another big question. These are great questions. Who wants to tackle that?
Okay, I'll dive in since we're in the lightning round.
Yeah.
I think it's one of the big things that I know that the three of us have talked about a lot is sort of, some of the people who got forgotten in the settlement movement and some of the blinders that, even the most well-intentioned social workers had on when they set this up, is that class and race especially, were not always considered, and there was not always equal treatment that went into them. One of the things that we wrestle with, I know, at the Gables is the idea of Americanization, the idea that a lot of times when our folks were out and talking to donors that they wanted to support the Gables, they talk about, well, this is, stripping the immigrant away from them and making them good Americans, which is obviously a very, very antiquated and gross statement, right? And one that was less than successful in practice, I should also say. But it is part of this legacy that we wrestle with, and it makes us really think about how do we think of ourselves as again, as I say, more of a two-way street, right? That we recognize that immigrant communities are being there, and how can we be a megaphone for what matters to them, and give them a platform to talk about who they are.
Anyone else?
I want to leave space in case Nadia wants to jump in, and I can go after you.
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, the settlement house movement is very complicated, and the reasons why settlement house workers got into this work is complicated. And a lot of it was about, pushing assimilation and Americanization in these spaces. That wasn't really Lillian Wald's main aim of a settlement house. I'm sure that I'm sure that she, coming from a middle upper class background, there were ways in which she wasn't seeing the impact of her decisions or, what she was observing, but she did, she thought that settlement houses were not set up in order to, that it shouldn't be set up in order to push assimilation as a goal. And it was more about providing resources and providing access so that people could thrive in their new home in the United States if they were new immigrants. So I guess I can speak to it from that side of how Lillian Wald operated. Go ahead, Nadia.
Hull House kind of was in the middle. So they were not really dedicated to assimilation or to removing the culture from the people who were attending Hull House and coming to programs. They were very actually appreciative of the diversity of the culture in the neighborhood and did a pretty good job of creating space where people could bring their culture with them and create art and create programming around it, while at the same time believing that having access to needed resources, having access to the arts and to wider cultural experiences allowed them to be better Americans, in that it allowed them to be more engaged in civic activity, more engaged in reform, and like being participatory with how they interacted with both their neighbors and the neighbor. I love that, by the way, both of you guys, the settlement houses also referred to the neighborhood people as neighbors, because Hull House did that as well. But in interacting with the people around them and with the larger city, that was fostering a way for them to be like I said, kind of, I don't know that it's written in those words, but kind of good Americans. So the race issue and class issue is more so with Hull House, that they didn't always, because the demographics shifted significantly starting in the 20s, and they didn't do as good a job fully working with and bringing more in terms of like leadership and like deeper areas of the settlement, like access to those communities, to the communities of color that came in later. Hull House was always an integrated space, and nobody was ever turned away, but they didn't do a good job with outreach. A lot of times they didn't necessarily incorporate programs that were needed by both specifically the Mexican and Black communities in their area, in the same way that they did the European community before that. That was something that changed over time. And there always was, like I said, there always was that participation and that presence at Hull House. It just wasn't as intentional, and it wasn't as fully inclusive. And it's something that was regretted by many of the people who worked there over time, especially in their later lives.
Great. And I want to thank you all, because we're a little bit over, just a few minutes. I'm sorry I could not get to all the questions, but thank you for a spirited discussion. I think the work that you're all doing is very meaningful and relevant. And I'm turning this over to Ashley now, and to bring us in.
I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Thank you so much. That I learned so much. I think every day how much I love my job, just because I learn so many different histories every day. That was really so wonderful. Thank you all for being here. I just want to remind you that our next webinar is on October 19th, and it will look at how sites of conscience can interpret and share histories, particularly marginalized histories that have not been accurately or thoroughly preserved. So please join us then. You can RSVP on our website. And as you're sort of wrapping up, I know we're short on time. We would really appreciate, I'm going to cast a poll on the screen, and if you could just, it's brief, it's anonymous, but it really helps us shape our future topics and approaches. And as I'm putting that up, I'll just thank our wonderful panelists and our moderator again for this just terrific session. I really am very grateful to you all. Thank you so much. So I'll leave the session open for a little bit so you can just take the poll. But thank you so much, and we hope to see you again soon. Bye, everyone.
Thank you all.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.